Welcome once again to Muse Aloud, a podcast where anonymous voices share their thoughts on a theme within a dreamscape of music and ambient sound. This is episode 6. It's about the city of Toronto, which is located on the shore of Lake Ontario. It is the largest city in Canada, and the provincial capital of the province of Ontario. Today's contributing voices are young millennials living in various neighborhoods in Toronto, and they speak on those neighborhoods, as well as their opinions on life in their city. It is in no way a complete representation of the entire city, as Toronto contains a multitude of struggles and experiences and realities well beyond what is discussed here. As always, Muse Aloud is best enjoyed on headphones. And now, episode 6. Toronto.
Toronto as a city, you mean?
I remember thinking downtown was like Bloor and Bathurst and like going to like efforts to like look cool, to like really more edgy, to like blend in.
I always loved it. I like being here.
So actually my dad had lived here back in the 80s for a couple years. He moved up here from New York in 1980, I want to say, 1979 or 1980, to open the first Covenant House location. So he had been working for, at the time it wasn't called Covenant House, or it had just become Covenant House, but he was working for the location in Times Square in New York. And they were looking to expand, and they were kind of assessing where the greatest needs were. And there was a priest here in Toronto who had heard about it was the Franciscan order. So there was a Franciscan priest here who heard about the program in Times Square, and he had written the head of the program and said, please come to Toronto, we have a real need. And everyone in New York thought that was a joke, because everyone thought of Canada as such a socially liberal country. Like, how could there be homeless kids? Everyone takes care of everybody up there, and it's too cold to be homeless. So they sent my dad up to investigate. And I think he came up with one other person, and they did a walk around overnight up and down Yonge Street. And after one night, they were like, it's desperate. Like, they need a program. So they sent Dad and another person to open the first house on George and Gerard. And he lived here for 2 years getting it off the ground. So I had been brought up as a very young kid. When I was 6 years old, I first visited, barely remember it, just to visit some of his old friends. And then throughout high school, we came in for a couple weekends over the summer because our dear family friends have a place out in Muskoka where we would go for like a week. And then because we were so nearby, Dad just couldn't resist coming into Toronto. So I had visited maybe a total of 4 times before I moved here myself.
Particularly when my parents, when I was young, I was an only kid until I was about 5. And then we moved to Ronsonsville around the time my brother Amadeo came into the picture. So that was the time when that neighborhood was kind of rough. A lot of artists and drug dealers and prostitutes. I remember there being basically like a prostitute house on the corner of our street parkway, and we usually didn't go out a lot at night. But now the neighborhood's changed quite drastically. It's a completely different world. But I remember as a kid, being a little kid and being outside and playing around, there were a lot of older couples on my street, not a lot of families. So I would be playing outside, and I was used to saying hello to people on our previous street on Eileen. And I used to remember waving at all these old Polish Eastern European couples, and they would just sort of ignore me. And I remember being really sad and sort of upset and frustrated, and that was the only thing that kind of really peeved me, because I was so used to people saying hello and being sort of cordial, but we were sort of seen as the weird outsiders, the wacky, loud Italian family. So it kind of was like a weird thing. Now it's so different. My brothers have grown up on the same street, but they live in a completely different world. There's so many young families, many from very diverse backgrounds. And it's just funny because whenever I go back there and I see what the neighborhood is like now, particularly that street, it was so different for me as a kid.
Yeah, I have family in the city, and my dad's family is from Oshawa. And so I'd been here several times as a kid, but always in sort of like the day trip capacity. So we'd come to see a show or have dinner or go to a ball game or something when I was visiting from out east. But I had never spent any sort of lengthy amount of time here before I moved here permanently.
I don't remember it well enough to know. Like in high school, I remember thinking it's so metropolitan, because coming from Pittsburgh, so small, so shitty at that time. Like Pittsburgh was so gross back then. Nothing like the reputation it has now. And also when you're a teenager, you just hate the place you're from. You're just angsty to get out. So coming to Toronto felt like, it felt like, oh my God, this is such a big city, and there were so many different kinds of people here.
I was really excited initially to be here, and then I sort of immediately had this really strong homesickness that I'd made a terrible choice and that I was way over my head, and I'd come from someplace much smaller, and so I have like this very distinct memory of like my third or fourth day at school, because I came here for school, and walking along Bloor Street on a Friday night in the Annex and just being terrified. And there just being like masses of young men and women on the street and feeling so uncomfortable and so out of place in this spot. And I went into a Blockbuster. I remember the time, and I just like rented a movie from Blockbuster because I didn't know what else to do with myself.
Yeah, I never meant to move to Toronto for school. It was I call it like a choice by accident, or like the choice I never made, because I meant to go to Boston or New York for school.
And just being very, very nervous and not being used to like the volume of people around.
I think it was much harder than I anticipated it being. I thought there would be a really kind of built-in school community, because that's what you get in the States. And it just does not translate. Not in Toronto anyway. I'm sure it does in the schools kind of outside of Toronto. But in this city this large, and with the campus being right downtown, and so many students commuting and so many students being international, I just feel like there's just no built-in campus life. It's not an automatic community.
Well, because it's a university, so it's in the middle of the city, which is really rare and strange. And I think it seems like almost like a little city in and of itself, because it is, essentially. But, you know, as soon as you stop going to school, I think you probably don't go out of your way necessarily to, like, walk through campus.
So I lived on residence. There was a bit of a community there. I certainly met, like, some wonderful friends there. But I also kind of made the assumption, like, I'm not really leaving the States. Like, it's not like I'm flying across an ocean. And I just underestimated the cultural differences. So I would say it was a much rougher transition than I anticipated.
I started 2 days before Frosh happened. And then, so yeah, it was like super highly pitched young people, booze, making out, everything. And I was so unprepared for that and so not into it either. And so, yeah, it was really, I was so overwhelmed in that first sort of go. And settled in really not until maybe 6 months later. Yeah. And
it was also like the thing I remember the most is the way people responded to me when they heard I was American, which I just didn't realize could work against me or for me, depending on who I was talking to. But it was something I had to adjust to and tread a line with.
I remember meeting people, and, you know, I guess specifically Australians, because they're everywhere. And people finding out that I was from Canada, and first, like, apologizing for assuming I was American.
So there was one guy who I ended up sitting next to at, like, an orientation event, and he he asked where I was from, and I said, oh, I'm from Pittsburgh. It's like 5.5 hours away. And he's like, yeah, I heard an accent. And just the way he said it, I was like, oh no, like, here we go. And then his next question was, are you a cheerleader? And I was like, what the fuck is that supposed to mean? I have never in my life been asked that fucking question. Is that supposed to be related to, are you American? Like, I just could not believe the leap he made from learning I was American to going, are you a cheerleader? I was like, all right, that's shutting that down.
And then they would ask, they'd just be like, oh, are you from BC? Are you from like Whistler? Are you from Vancouver? Because so many of them go to Whistler specifically to, for ski season to do the work abroad. And I'd be like, oh, no, I'm from Toronto. And it actually, like, I remember being really surprised at how many people didn't know where Toronto was, or like that it was the biggest city in the country. And I was like, really? Toronto Film Fest, like International Film Festival, like Toronto and like, how do you not know?
Toronto is like a center. There is a center, there's an energy about it. And I think other people who do come from other parts of the world, and I think even from other parts of Canada, when they are here, they usually, I think, see the good sides as well.
I would say new, multicultural, very common to like a lot of other urban cities you may have been in that there are a lot of people in a small space, and there's a public transit system that's not very good. I would say it's a surprisingly dated public transit system. When you look at it, it's like being in a museum of the 70s of public transit. That's probably what, I think I have literally said those words to visitors who've been like, oh, your public transit system is so interesting. I'm like, yes, it looks like a museum. St. George looks like it was ripped out of the 70s. It is unfortunate. So I probably would use those words because I've done that already.
I think it's my favorite city in the whole world. Like I love it more than any other place I've ever been. It's the only place I've ever lived, in spite of the fact that I've lived in other places, much longer, and grew up in places. Like, it's the only place I've ever felt that I was really at home, and it's the only place I ever want to go back to. It feels right. I think it's a great city with a lot of issues, but I don't feel like our issues are unique at all. I think that a lot of things that make us great are unique, but a lot of things that suck are just part of living in a society with other humans. People talk about, oh, Toronto sucks because of, the transit, or Toronto sucks because of the people. And it's, people are people wherever you go.
I would say that Toronto is the only city, in my experience, that feels like you can live in a small town within a city. Because of the neighborhood names and the neighborhood states and the way they exist, and how people know, like, I live on Queen West, I live in Parkdale, I live in the Annex, I live in Leslieville. Like, people know this about where they live in Toronto, and they are aware of their neighborhood situation. On top of that, it becomes like a make or break when someone lives on the east or west end of the city and you want to date or something. Like, it becomes like there are all these little ways that the neighborhood aspect of Toronto really plagues you in your everyday life. But again, I can go on a tangent about that, and I won't.
Toronto's weird. Toronto, as I'm getting older, feels so small. It's a big city, and like, I totally get if you're coming from somewhere else, especially if you're coming from a smaller town or a smaller city, which is every other place in Canada, that the city can feel really huge and big and overwhelming, but it's just not. I think Toronto wants to feel like it's a bigger city than it is. And yeah, I think Toronto, I love the city, but it feels like it's preening a bit sometimes. Like, it's trying to put on a show for the rest of the world to finally accept it and be like, okay, you're cool, you can sit with us.
I like Toronto. I think I still have a hard time believing I live here full time, because it just never was meant. It wasn't part of my plan, so I have to kind of always adjust my thinking and be like, yeah, this is life now. Like, I have permanent residence and everything. There's no reason to think like anything's going to change. So I still think of myself very much as like an outsider, and it's not really home. But that said, that brings kind of an interesting perspective.